So something happened yesterday that's getting quite a bit of traction, and there's quite a bit of conversation going on around it. About 100 pro-choice protesters showed up at Brett Kavanaugh's house after we learned that the Supreme Court is probably going to overturn Roe versus Wade. So let me throw up that graphic for you here. This is in Bloomberg. Abortion rights protests target homes of Kavanaugh and Roberts. About 100 protesters march between their Maryland houses. It follows leak of draft opinion overturning Roe versus Wade. So, this is definitely a first. At least I think. As far as I know of, it's a first. Correct me if I'm wrong, guys. And this is following the other first of the leak of a Supreme Court decision. Now, people on the political right are sort of trying to make that the bulk of the conversation, the fact that there was a leak as opposed to the substance of the leak. And I find that incredibly disingenuous because I don't even see what the issue is with the leak. In fact, I don't think there is an issue. It's just sort of like a mucked up issue. And the only argument you can make is this violates like civility and tradition and the norms, but who cares? Who cares? I would support a leak of any and all of the decisions, even if it's a decision that cuts in the direction that I would agree with politically. I just don't see the problem with it. And I don't think the people who are criticizing it really see a problem with it either. I think they're just trying to gin up some fake outrage around that. So, but now this is a new first showing up to the Supreme Court justices' houses. So let me read you a little bit from this. About 100 protesters took the battle over abortion rights to the homes of two conservative U.S. Supreme Court justices Saturday night. Now, I'm going to get to this in a little bit, but Kavanaugh was actually worse in terms of his take on this case. Roberts had a much different take, which, again, I'll describe in a little bit. This is 5 days after a leaked draft opinion suggested the court is poised to overturn Roe versus Wade. Bearing signs and chanting slogans, the group marched from Brett Kavanaugh's house in Chevy Chase, Maryland, to Chief Justice John Roberts' residence about half a mile away. The protesters then returned to Kavanaugh's before police ordered them to disperse. It wasn't clear whether either justice's family was home. The protest was a fresh demonstration of the growing vitriol over abortion as the court considers eliminating constitutional protections. The issue exploded Monday when Politico published the leak of the draft opinion. So they talked to somebody who helped organize the protests, and there's a quote here from them. The person's name is Lacey Wooten Holloway, 39 years old. Quote, "The time for civility is over. Being polite doesn't get you anywhere." Kavanaugh is one of 5 justices who cast the preliminary vote to overturn Roe. CNN later reported that Roberts opposed overturning Roe completely and was trying to forge a compromise that would leave parts of the ruling intact while upholding a Mississippi law that limits abortion at 15 weeks of pregnancy. Okay, so let me explain what's happening there a little bit, because that's actually really interesting. So the way Roe versus Wade works, they set up what's called the trimester standard. So in the first trimester, or the first 1/3 of the pregnancy, the government cannot regulate it, cannot ban it. Basically, it's the total right of the woman to choose during that first trimester. Now, under Roe, in the second trimester, states are allowed, if they so choose, to do some basic health regulations around that. And then with the third trimester, states are allowed, if they so choose, to ban abortions in that third trimester. That was Roe versus Wade. So this notion, that Roe versus Wade is like this far left idea is just factually not true. In fact, it's a very moderate framework, if you ask me, and it's very nuanced in terms of what's allowed and what isn't allowed. Now, after Roe, there was this case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992. And in that case, though they largely upheld Roe versus Wade, they changed the standard slightly. So instead of going by the trimester standard, they went by the fetal viability standard. So it basically made it so that abortion is still allowed as a right early on in the pregnancy, but you're allowed to do some regulations, including some maybe slightly more onerous regulations post-viability of the fetus. So we've inched slightly in a more conservative direction since Roe versus Wade with that Casey standard. And what John Roberts was trying to do, now, by the way, John Roberts cares a lot about what one would call the integrity of the court. So in other words, he wants to make sure that they don't become irrelevant and dismissed, as previously in U.S. history the court has when they've gone extreme, when they've gone too extreme. They sort of lose their potency, and people don't want to abide by their rulings at all. And so I think he cares about that. more so than the other justices. And so he wanted to basically do another slight weakening of the Casey standard and maybe shift that line up that you can regulate or ban abortion to 15 weeks or later as opposed to like 20 weeks or later. So it's very interesting. The politics of this decision is very interesting. Roberts was trying to be a more nuanced voice, a more moderate voice, but he was dealing with the likes of Kavanaugh and Coney Barrett and Gorsuch and Clarence Thomas. And of course, they're of the opinion, just, totally axe row and leave the issue completely up to the states so that if Mississippi, for example, or Alabama wants to ban abortion completely, they can ban abortion completely. Roberts did not want that. And again, I think the reason why he didn't want it is because he's concerned about the long-term integrity of the court. And they might lose standing in the eyes of the American people if they go too extreme. So that's all interesting to me. So they continue here and say, Roberts and Kavanaugh earlier declined to comment on the protests. The court, as a matter of policy, does not discuss security arrangements, Supreme Court spokeswoman Patricia McCabe said Friday. Fencing was erected around the Supreme Court building this week, much like the barriers put up after the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol. So they erected, as soon as we learned from Politico what was going on with this decision, they erected security fencing around the Supreme Court. And of course, people showed up at the Supreme Court pretty much immediately after that. Now, everything to this point has been totally peaceful. So, you could argue maybe they're being a little too sensitive. But look, I get it. If you're on the Supreme Court or if you're a politician, the idea of having extra security, I don't find absurd. Now, the deeper question gets to what these specific protesters did. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it, neither? And here's my take on it. I think that whoever basically did the doxxing, which gave away the addresses, I don't think doxing is acceptable. I think doxing, even when it comes to like social media terms of service and what should and shouldn't be allowed in terms of free speech on various social media outlets, I always add that to my list of the very few things that, you shouldn't be allowed. So you can't do direct threats of violence. You can't do targeted harassment. Very few things. Doxing, I think, is on that list. And outside of the very basic things, we should totally embrace free speech. You can't censor somebody based on the content of what they say or their political opinion. But doxing is on that list of like, look, that goes too far. Because inherent in doxing is a threat. I think it's a violation of people's privacy to some extent. So I don't like the doxing in the first place. But keep it real. After the doxing happened, that one person is at fault. The protesters themselves, I really don't have any issue with protesters going to a Supreme Court justice's place and basically standing up for what they think is right and being totally peaceful. That's the crucial point of it. And a lot of people are saying, oh my God, this is extreme. Oh my God, this goes too far. Oh my God, we've opened this door. And look, the fact of the matter is, who really opened the door? The Supreme Court opened the door by deciding we're going to take away something that has been viewed since 1973 as a fundamental right. So, if you don't want protesters to show up to your house and do this, maybe don't take away people's constitutional rights. Now, you might think that's a flippant or a glib response. I really don't think that's flippant or glib. I really don't. And I agree with the interpretation that it kind of is a right. And so if somebody comes to take those away, it calls for a drastic response. Now, again, if any of this had turned violent, I would immediately turn on it and say, you can't do that. You shouldn't do that. That's also immoral. That's also unethical. But the fact of the matter is, like, this is the compromise position. The compromise position is like, let's go protest about this. And the fact that it's uncomfortable as to how they're doing the protest is the point of the protest. Hey, maybe you'll stop and think twice before you make a decision that's going to affect millions of people in a negative fashion. Now, is it actually going to work in terms of changing their minds? Well, probably not. Probably not. But there should be social pressure that's brought to bear and consequences for terrible actions. I wish that Dick Cheney and George W. Bush could never leave their house without, feeling like I'm a pariah. There should be protests when they go to the grocery store. They should be reminded every day of their lives, you have the blood of hundreds or of thousands of innocent Iraqis on your hands. So, this is one of those instances where the doxing should have never happened in the first place. So we should know where these people live. But after that doxing happened, it's par for the course that you're going to have protests that target them. Now, again, I want to reiterate, everything's been peaceful. If it wasn't peaceful, then I would condemn it, because I'm a strong believer in peaceful protests, and I'm a big opponent of violent protests or rioting. But there was no rioting. Nothing hasn't been peaceful, so I don't really see a reason to criticize this. And remember, I took a lot of crap as well. I don't know how many of you agree with my take on this or don't, but I'm consistent on this, man. I took a lot of crap as well when I came out in favor of what a bunch of protesters did with Kyrsten Sinema. She was being a professor, and, you know, you had people who were protesting for her to support Build Back Better. They went to her classroom and they started, you know, talking to her, saying, look, I can't get a meeting with you. I'm one of your constituents. And you shut me out, and instead you're meeting with the pharma lobbyists, and you're meeting with big money interests and corporations. So I don't have $100,000 to give you to meet with you. So now I'm going to come and confront you to your face. And then they followed her into the bathroom, and they were pressing her on her inability to vote for Build Back Better. Now, it didn't end up working, but as a matter of principle, that's a tactic I support. You look, the line is violence. That's the line. The line is violence. If that line isn't crossed, then you should support any and all actions to try to bring accountability for these people's actions. So really, the chain of events started with what? Started with the decision that we're going to overturn Roe versus Wade, and we're going to leave it up to states to take away the right to an abortion. And now we're even having a conversation, we'll get to this later, about a national abortion ban in all 50 states. That's on the table. You know what else is on the table? Certain states banning all different forms of contraception, like an IUD, or like, you know, the morning after pill, or like condoms. This is actually in the conversation now. So what is the response to such extremism? What is the proper response to such extremism? The proper response is to use any and every tool at our availability to try to bring about change. And if that means making some elitist ghouls uncomfortable, so be it. So be it. Now, again, the doxxing should have never happened in the first place, and whoever did the doxxing, I would have no problem with that being illegal and some sort of action being taken against the doxer through official legal channels. But once that's done, okay, it is what it is. And look, when you talk about politicians, when you talk about the president or people in the executive branch, when you talk about the judicial branch, these people have phenomenal power. And you don't want them to be insulated from the consequences of their actions. And so this is a natural consequence of you making a decision that is completely unpopular. There's one poll that's up to 70% of the country says don't overturn Roe. Now, it depends how you ask the question about abortion. That'll, determine what answer you get. But there's some polls, as few as 5% of the country want to see abortion totally banned. As high as 19% of the country says abortion should be illegal in all circumstances. When that's your decision, yes, there's going to be consequences for that action, and you need to live with those consequences. And if it makes you think twice the next time you overturn precedent to go in a more draconian and authoritarian direction, well, then that's a good thing. That's a good thing. And look, keep it real. You got to be consistent on this. You got to be consistent. Does this mean that, let's say in a hypothetical world, you have President Bernie Sanders gets us Medicare for all. And then you have some pharma-funded ghouls on the far right who some single bad actor, doxes Bernie's vacation home or whatever. And he's on vacation. And then you have some right-wingers who show up there, but they're peaceful, but they're protesting against single-payer healthcare. And they're arguing, they have pictures of Bernie like Stalin or something and the hammer and sickle, and they're arguing that he's like a dictator or whatever. Well, if you're being consistent, you'd say even in that circumstance, they kind of have a right to do that. They're not violating any law, You can get into the specifics of, are they trespassing or whatever, but really, that's allowed. That's like core First Amendment stuff. Again, as long as violence isn't happening, it is what it is. It's par for the course. So I'm consistent on this. The doxing should have never happened, and it shouldn't happen of any of these people. But once it does happen, if people learn where a politician lives, a Supreme Court justice lives, or whatever, they're allowed to protest peacefully. So, and by the way, there was something on Twitter. I don't know if this is accurate, but somebody on Twitter said, one of the arguments that was being made was like, okay, we get it about Kavanaugh, but what about the neighbors? What if you're like upsetting the neighbors? And the response was, one of the organizers said, I am a neighbor. I am one of Kavanaugh's neighbors. That's one of the, I guess that's one of the reasons why they found out where he is, right? Where he lives. So look, it's hard to get upset about breaches of decorum and civility when rights are getting taken away. Now, from their perspective, they say, well, it never should have been a right in the first place. Okay, fair enough. But then there's people, myself included, who think, well, it kind of is a right. It's going to be a hard time. You're going to have a hard time convincing me that it's not a right, at least up until the point where the nervous system is created in the fetus, and so therefore the fetus can feel pain. I think that's a different moral question, a different ethical question. I have a somewhat moderate stance on abortion, but I think Roe versus Wade got it right overall. And so don't tell me that, the state should have the right to force a woman to be an incubator, even when we're talking about super early on in the pregnancy. No. And that's what they're doing here. That's what they're doing. Send it back to the states. It's going to be banned in over 20 states. And there's consequences to that, man. There really are. So I'll just give you a little bit more from this article because there's still a whole bunch of interesting stuff in this. So White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki on Thursday declined to criticize the practice of protesting outside a justice's home. Quote, I don't have an official U.S. government position on where people protest, she said. We want it, of course, to be peaceful. I actually totally agree with that position. I totally agree with it. Now, of course, she would change her tune if the protesters started targeting her, and she would be a hypocrite in that instance, right? But I think she's right with what she says here. And by the way, kind of surprising because I would have guessed that they would immediately do the traditions, the norms, the civility. How dare you do that? But she didn't. But other Democrats did. Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Dick Durbin of Illinois, a Democrat, this week criticized protests at the homes of justices and other public officials as demeaning an adolescent. Demeaning an adolescent. I actually think it's people trying to fight for what is right and using one of the tools available, which is one that we rarely use. Quote, the events of the past week have intensified the focus on the Supreme Court justices' families who are unfortunately facing threats to their safety in today's increasingly polarized political climate. Now, that's what John Cornyn said. He's a Republican, I think, from Texas. Now, if families are experiencing threats, I totally condemn that. Nobody should be threatening anybody. And I don't think it's a fair argument to say, well, since the decision is so bad and so wrong and taking away constitutional rights, therefore the families, it's legitimate to threaten the families. I don't agree with that. Direct threats of violence are wrong, period, across the board. And, the families of these people didn't do it. And even if you're threatening the individuals, again, that's not how you handle situations like this. That is, you don't do an immoral or unethical action to counter an immoral and unethical action. That's just adding to the amount of wrongness and immorality in the question. So I don't agree with that, but I don't even know if that's accurate, by the way. It's a Republican senator who said it. Who knows what he's basing it on? I haven't seen any articles that say there have been direct threats. I did see, though, and this one we will condemn wholeheartedly. There was an attack, I don't know if it was just a vandalized office or if there was some explosive or something, but there was an attack on one of those pro-life organizations, and somebody wrote where they did it, as long as abortions aren't safe, you aren't either, something to that effect. That I don't agree with. Again, you can't do any sort of violence because the violence by its very nature is wrong unless it's defensive, right? And this isn't a case of, it's not defensive. It's not this abortion group, that overturned it. And again, even if they did overturn it, it's something that we have to debate and that we need to get the right policy conclusions implemented. But you have to do that in a way that doesn't destroy what is actually moral and ethical in the country. So in other words, you can't resort to immoral and unethical actions to counter immoral and unethical actions. That's just you being a hypocrite. And that's just you saying, I'm not really against the immorality and the unethical nature of it. I'm just against their side. And that is not okay. Again, we want to, every legal and peaceful method to fight back, we should use, which is why I'm a defender of the protesters who showed up at their houses. Because it is legal and it is peaceful. That's all I need to know, right? So, but it's not legal to, I don't know if they used a pipe bomb or if they just vandalized the office or whatever, to issue direct threats and to, target one of those groups. It's not It's a bad road to go down. And by the way, when the left tries to take on the right in the arena of violence, that doesn't usually go well for the left, because it's the right that has all the weapons and the right that's willing to use those violent tactics a hell of a lot more and more aggressively. So you just don't want to open that door. But anyway, the events of the past week have intensified the focus on the Supreme Court justice families who are unfortunately facing threats to their safety in today's increasingly polarized political climate. Roberts, who has ordered an investigation of the leak, that's also bullshit. You don't need an investigation. On Thursday, called the leak absolutely appalling. No, what's appalling is the decision. The leak is not appalling. By the way, if the leak is appalling, why is it appalling? Is it because the decision itself is appalling? But no, you would argue, oh, it's just the tradition being violating is appalling. That's not appalling at all. That's fine. So we learned about it a little bit early. So more information for the public is a good thing. And said the person responsible would be foolish to think it would affect the court's deliberations. The justices are scheduled to rule in the case by July. Unfortunately, I kind of agree with that. I don't think that it's going to affect their ruling. I don't. But I still think you have to apply all the pressure you can. And if it just makes them stop and think twice before issuing another horrendously terrible decision that negatively impacts millions of people, I'll take it. And we'll see if it does that. But again, the doxxing is wrong. Protesting is not wrong. And anybody who does pearl clutching over this is kind of annoying. It's kind of annoying because you can't care more about civility and decorum than real world action to try to change things for the better. And a lot of people do. But everybody's so hypocritical on the civility and decorum thing. They only trot out concerns about civility and decorum when it's to protect their side. That's at least that's what I've witnessed. You know, if you flip the political situation and it's like a left-wing justice and a left-wing decision is coming down and right-wing protesters show up to their house, then the right would be defending them and saying, look, it's First Amendment right. You might not like it, but they're doing what's perfectly legal and peaceful, so it's fine. But since you flip it and it's left-wing protesters, right-wing justice, all of a sudden it's, this is egregious. Tim Pool said this might be civil war starting. So anyway, there you have it. Again, the doxing is wrong, and that should be opposed. But the protests themselves, this is politics 101, man. Direct action over a direct issue. It's peaceful. It's legal. That's all I got to know about it. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.